Second morning, everyone. So we're here in Ways and Means. It is January 15th at 10:33. And we have Ezra back with us again this morning to go deeper into the Ed Fund outlook. This is going to be, this is the core of our work this year. And so really just want to make sure that we all have a chance to understand how all the different pieces fit together. And on some level, we'll be going deeper into each of those pieces with testimony. So with that, Ezra, if you want to join us.
Thank you very much, Chair. Very nice to see you all again this morning. Yeah. And Julie is going to be up here in case I need to phone a friend for any of your questions. So as long as that's okay with all of you. All right, so she's also going to help out with some of the technology. So once we've got the presentation on the screen, as long as that's okay with you, we can get started. There we go. All right, so as Chair Kornheiser said, I am Ezra Holden. I work for the Joint Fiscal Office, and today I am going to continue yesterday's overview of the Education Fund outlook, but we're going to stay high level, but just a little bit more in depth and try and break it out into a few more digestible pieces so that you're not just looking at this whole sheet at once and get a little lost in all the different lines and columns here. And so with that being.
Do you pause for 1 second? I just hear everyone pulling out their outlooks and I just wanted to give a chance for that to happen so we could still hear you. Great.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Back at it.
All right, so with that being said, my goal today is twofold. First of all, I am going to enhance your ability to read the outlook again, so you can see some of the sections, not just as a large whole. And then two, help you see how money flows into the Ed Fund and also where it's flowing out and how it flows through all the way to the bottom. So I think that's really helpful for when you're thinking about designing really thoughtful and effective policy. So with that being said, we'll just go ahead to the next slide here. Oh, yes, you got it. So why is this Education Fund outlook so important? Well, so this is like you heard yesterday from Craig, this is the December 1 letter outlook. So this is what we constructed with tax using that December 1 information. And that is how we reached this iteration of the outlook. As the session goes on, the outlook evolves and changes as information changes and as all of you have made your policy decisions. And so this is where, as your policy, like I said, your policy ideas are introduced, whether it's a different type of tax, a different type of weighting, whatever, that will change one piece on the outlook, flows through all the way to the bottom. So let's just start off with the first page. So so if you take a look at this all at once, it can be a little bit overwhelming. You've got 3 different columns there, 3 different fiscal years, 40 different rows. I mean, it's a lot of information. So we're just going to break it into little bits and pieces for you here. So those 3 columns that I reference are 3 fiscal years. First, our most recent fiscal year, which here is fiscal year 2024. In the middle, you have our current fiscal year, which is 2025. And then we have a look ahead year, which for this session will be 2026. And that way you can see, what has happened, what is currently happening, and what we are forecasting for the future. So you can have kind of that range when you're thinking about either the performance of a tax or, what expenditures are looking like. You can immediately see the before and after compared to right now. And so we'll just move on to section 1, which are the summary lines. And you'll notice on your outlook that they are distinct and that they're numbered, they are not numbered, they are lettered. So that's a good clue to see which ones are the summary lines for you. And so these summary lines exist to just give you a quick snapshot of some of the more important Ed fund metrics such as the tax rates from the December 1 letter. You can see those up at the top, A, B, and C, and then some of the yield figures that will be set in the yield bill. And you can see those as D and E. And so that's just a nice to have those right at the top while you're thinking about some of these other line items here. So we'll move next to the second section, which are the sources, and those.
We actually go back for a second.
Yeah.
And so I just like, I think what's helpful about this is it's sort of the big picture factors that go into the yield and the top line yield pieces all in one place. Just
Absolutely.
reiterate that. Thanks.
All right, so we're good to keep going. Okay, so we have here the source lines, which are the revenues of the ed fund, if you want to think of it that way. And if you were with us for last week's joint session on Ed Finance 101, you will recall that property tax rates make up the majority of ed fund revenues. And we also have some non-property tax revenues as well. And so for fiscal year 26, we're forecasting that about 34% of those revenues will be coming from the gross homestead property taxes, another 39% from your non-homestead property taxes, and that remaining 33% is coming from non-property taxes. And now I know what all of you are thinking, gee, I'm not in finance, but those numbers don't add up to 100%. And you would be right, because we have.
Was anyone actually thinking that?
It's supposed to be my icebreaker.
Your icebreaker.
Yeah, so the reason we would be at over 100 is because as all of you are probably aware, we have something in Vermont called the property tax credits. And so I said, our gross homestead property taxes. But once we have pulled out those property tax credits, which serve here as a negative revenue, when you're thinking about your sources, that is how you get to your 100% of that $2.4 billion there on line 10. And so just quickly, some of these other non-property revenues, you can see we have sales and use tax, a portion.
We're going to spend time tomorrow on sales and tomorrow, soon we're talking about sales and use tax in greater depth. Yes.
So a question that's been bothering me for years. If we get rid of the ed fund and use something like income tax or some other source, do we then get rid of this deficit? The 155 million that we spend on credit? Do we get rid of that deficit? So
Representative Brannigan, this is poor man's first time sitting in the chair.
I would just say that.
Just hold that.
Just hold.
I would say that would be a policy choice, because if you could continue to maintain a property tax credit and fund it with a different source, if that was your, as a collective body's decision, it is in the education fund due to policy choices. That's all that I would say to that.
Your question, and probably a dumb one, is the property tax credit the same as the renter rebate?
So that is a great question. I'll phone a friend because I haven't worked with that.
I'm just
Julia?
concerned about the nomenclature here.
For the record, I'm Julia Victor, Joint Fiscal Office. It's a great question because the answer is no. It is not the same thing as the property tax credit. So the renter rebate is a distinct policy, different than the property tax credit. It's funded out of the general fund, not out of the education fund. I'd be happy to follow up with some resources about that. It'd be helpful.
So the renter rebate does not affect the education fund?
It is, I guess, my hemming and hawing is the term effect. I guess the question would be, how does it play into policy choices? If it is impacting policy decisions in terms of how you're setting the non-homestead rate or the homestead rate, maybe one could argue it is affecting the education fund. But when looking at the ed fund outlook, it is not showing up here as a direct cost to the education fund.
But does the renter rebate then affect the homestead property tax income here, this 100 and?
No, so the renter rebate is not showing up in any of these
In-
lines.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or would you like me to continue?
Yes, please, thank you.
All right, great. So, but yeah, so we have a variety of non-property tax related revenue sources here that I'm sure you all will take a look at later this session. So, we can then move on to the appropriation section. And so, we've seen now how the money comes in, and now it's time to see how the money goes out through these appropriations. And so I'll just start off with another quick callback to last week's session. So Julia explained to all of us, the education payment is and that's on line 11 there. That is a technical term that we use, and it is the sum of education spending, which is a school district's budget minus their offsetting revenues. And then
Also a technical term.
yes, that's correct. That Julia touched on last week. Would you like me to reiterate the definition
I
or?
think that's really helpful because I think the difference between spending on education and education spending is a little counterintuitive.
Sure. So the difference is that like offsetting revenues can be something, like if a school had a surplus from the prior year, that would be pulled off of their budget for this year. And then if they had any, I suppose, private fundraising or another example would be.
Sure, offsetting revenues, categorical aid, so if the school district is receiving, special education dollars, tech ed, flexible pathways, those are considered offsetting revenues, tuition revenues from another school district. So basically, everything that the school district is getting in terms of funds that are for a specific purpose or have been raised in a specific manner beyond just receiving a sum from the ed fund.
All right, so so that is all summed up into that education payment line there. And which Julie just said on, we also have the categorical aid appropriations. And those are designated for specific purposes such as special education, transportation, small school support. And those are usually calculated in a formulaic manner. So, whether it's the agency or whoever sets that formula will then just use that to reach the amount that you see on that line there. And then, so when you're looking at your outlook, that would be lines 12 through 21 are the variety of categorical aid that we have going on here. And then below that.
I have a question about the categorical aids that I'm sorry if it's a little too deep in here. How much do these lines tend to vary from year to year? And how much is sort of up to local districts to be making decisions about how much they get in these categorical aid and how much of it is the forces of the universe?
So, that is a great question. I really am just familiar with the immediate 3 years on this sheet. I have not been here quite long enough to soak in all the history. Julia, do you know if there is more variation than what we can see on this here, or is this kind of the level of variation that they would expect to see?
So it really I would say it really depends on the categorical aid line. For instance, I would call your attention to the small school support and merger support line here, line 16. You can see in FY24 it was about 8 million, and then in FY25 dropped down to 1.8 million. The reason for that, there was a policy choice. There was made in Act 127 to change that categorical aid line. Other lines here, and this may be helpful for a deeper dive. Each one of these lines have certain assumptions or formulas baked into them. So, for instance, special education, the majority of those funds are a census block grant. That's from Act 173 that was passed several years ago. So you can see those costs increasing. Others are really more formulaic. English learner services, this was also new in Act 127. So it depends on the line.
Representative Holcomb, do you still have something or do you change?
Yeah, I guess I didn't really understand the question because I think my understanding has always been that categorical aid is for issues that really aren't in the control of, it's why, for example, we don't do weights for special ed because it could be manipulated. So it's for things that are costs that are driven and assigned based on demographics generally, because otherwise you're creating perverse incentives locally. So I guess I'm curious about your use of the word categorical, because these are things that I don't know that districts can really control because they're distributed by policy decisions.
Julia, do you want to respond to that?
Sure, I would say it does get into that nuance of what is local control? What is the definition of local control? I will say that, as I'm sure you're aware, certain lines here are reimbursements. So transportation aid is 50% reimbursement to the school district for their transportation costs. If that's a local decision, that's not my place to say. But the background of some of these are more interlinked with school district decisions than others.
I don't understand that last statement.
So I guess the reason I asked the question was because in my experience, some of these, a local district could make a decision, transportation's the great example, decide to spend much more on transportation because they're willing to cover the other 50% out of their budget, and then the state matches that 50%. That's one example, and I think there's other places where that could happen. And when we get into sort of, yeah.
Can I ask the question? And maybe this is too specific. Special education aid, there was a pretty big jump between FY 24 and FY 25. And if that's a block grant, so if you're sort of saying like, this is how much we get, were there that many more students identified, or what's driving that big increase from 24 to?
I don't want to speak towards I would want to go back and look. I'm not ready to speak off the cuff about that. I will say that there have been recent changes to special education funding. The Agency of Education in their budget book has outlined some of the background in terms of the drivers of the cost, but we can certainly get back to that.
And I think likely we're going to take more testimony on every single one of these lines, because I think it's really important to understand the interplay between sort of the ed fund, the local districts, and how these play out in various ways. Back to you, Ezra.
Oh, all right. So, anyways, I think we were just leaving off with, so categorical lines 12 through 21. Below that, you have, state teacher pensions, one-time lines, and, other uses like miscellaneous expenses on there. So, and that's the gist of the appropriation line. So.
Does everyone understand what those acronyms? Will you just,
So, the VSTRs, is that?
yeah, and I guess everyone knows what a PCB is, yes?
So, the VSTRs is the Vermont State Teachers Association or pension, and then you have PCB.
You don't have to say that word on the record, it's okay.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, I'm gonna butcher it.
And then, but OPEB and COLA and CMF transfer would be.
So COLA is a cost of living adjustment, so that goes into pensions every year. If that was higher, then maybe the fund could bear, there could go one-time transfer to support that. OPEB, that one escapes me. Do you remember what OPEB is?
Sure, OPEB is other post-employment benefits, so
Okay.
that's like healthcare.
Okay, thank you.
For retirees, yeah.
Yes.
Return.
And the VSTRS, that stands for Vermont State Teacher Retirement System.
And CMF, I believe, is the Computer Modernization Fund? Yeah, and so that's just to upgrade on computers. Yeah. So, okay, so now that we've taken a look at the revenue and the appropriations, it's now time to see how these two interact in the allocation of revenue section. And so in these rows here, the sources and appropriations interact and are either allocated to one of the reserves, which you'll see here are stabilization or additional reserves, or they will flow through to the bottom line of the ed fund. The total of these allocations is what you see there on my line 32. And so that's will lead us just right into the stabilization reserve itself. So this is a statutorily established reserve established in Title 16. And so this reserve target is redetermined every year, and it's set at 5% of your prior fiscal year's net education appropriations. And so since that amount, more likely than not changing every year, you then will have a new target every year. And if the current year target is greater than what you had last year, the difference needs to be raised by the ed fund to ensure that you reach that statutorily suggested number. Okay. And so that's just what you see going on here in these lines. And you'll see the target line was on line 36. The prior year was on line 33. And so then you need that line 34 to meet that target number there.
Can we go back to slide 12? Sorry.
This one?
Oh, 11.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to, can we just sort of spend a moment on each line to explain what it is? Because I feel like this is one of the more confusing parts for the outlook.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
So let me just zoom in here so I can actually give you the right line numbers. So line 27, that's your revenue surplus or deficit line. And that would be the total sources line minus your total uses line. And then you have that remainder there. If it's a deficit, it would be negative. If it was a surplus, it would be positive. 28 is your prior year reversions. And prior year reversions are if you have a pool of money from a past fiscal year that was set aside for something and it was not spent or obligated, eventually it is reverted back into the general pot and it comes back as a revenue. So you see on the far right column, that's blank, that's FY26. So we're still in FY25. We don't know what hasn't been spent yet, but in that middle column, you see 24.3. So that is saying, there were $24.3 million that were obligated were not obligated, but had been set aside. And now they're saying, look, this is not going to be spent. It can revert it back into the ed fund. So that adds in 24 million on that. So
this might be a obnoxious question. I'm sorry if it is, but if we're still living in that fiscal year, how do we know that we have those reversions?
okay, so the 24.3 would come from FY fiscal years 24 or before. So since the books have been closed on that because we are currently in fiscal year 25, so it's just been determined that the books are closed. This money's not going to be spent like we thought it was. So here it is. That's why our fiscal year 26 is blank, because you're right. We don't know what will happen this year, which is that middle column FY25. So that's why 26 is blank and it will remain blank until they've closed out 25 and they've been able to say, look, it's not going to be spent.
So the reversions that are in this fiscal year are the money that wasn't spent in last fiscal year.
Yes, correct. So there's a lag there.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about reversions when we get the budget adjustment bill as well.
Okay, so line 29, that is the transfer to and from the stabilization reserve, which we're just getting into. So you'll see on that far right column minus 3.5. That's because the target moved up by 3.5 million compared to the last year. So we need to take 3.5 million and set that aside for the stabilization reserve to reach that target number.
Why did it go up?
So it is the 5% of the prior fiscal year's net appropriation. So, as expenses generally tend to increase, that means that 5% should generally to increase, which means we have to set aside a little bit more to cover that number.
Thank you.
Below that, as we will get to, the additional reserve transferred to or from. So you see in 24, transferred 13 million into an additional reserve. The next year transferred out 13, and this year it's blank because additional reserves are set by you all. So as of right now, there hasn't been anything set aside for fiscal year 26. You could choose to keep it that way, or you could choose to create an additional reserve, which we can touch upon in a couple slides here.
Okay.
And
Representative Feltes, did you have your hand?
I just wanted to clarify back when we're talking about these allocations, well, about the stabilization reserve.
sure,
For 26, the projected, what we need is 55.6 because it's 5% of something or other. Whereas in the previous year, on line 33, it was 52.1.
okay, let me see, can we, yes, thank you, Julie. Okay, I'm with you.
And is the difference of how we get to the 3.5 on line 29 is what you want to add extra into the stabilization reserve?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, it's the difference between the 55 and the 52 means we need the 3.5.
Exactly, and exactly. So, and if you look at the next column, you will see that in that row 29, there was a 5 million being moved into the reserve.
Yes.
And you'll see the 47 went to 52.1. There's a little bit of rounding, it looks like, but that's your 5. So yes, that's exactly right. Mhm. And just to finish up the allocation. So here on the line 31 was a one-time transfer. So if there are any one-time allocations that are needed, those can be put in there.
And was that one in particular because of sort of a legislative, an accidental legislative loophole that we closed? Julia?
I don't know if it's accidental or not.
Yeah, so we're talking about that BAA one-time transfer. Yeah, so that was, cannabis revenues, the sales and use had been booked to after school, but were flowing into the education fund. So this one-time transfer was to say, hey, these cannabis revenues had been flowing into the ed fund, but they were supposed to be directed to after school. So we needed to pull them out of the fund and put them into this.
And I'm mostly flagging that because those sort of one-time transfers out of the ed fund are fairly rare. And so like, that's not, just sort of want to name that for future precedent as we're doing our planning.
Yeah, sure. And then the final line here, line 32, transfer to or from unreserved unallocated. So that is the total of all of the changes that have happened in this allocation section. So that 28.6 plus that 3.5 is how you reach that 32.1. And it is saying here that we are transferring from our unreserved unallocated dollars, which you could, I guess, call extra dollars. We are transferring from that to cover our revenue surplus or deficit and that 5%, or if you all decided to establish an additional reserve, that would show up here and impact that number as well. Does that answer your?
The fact that it's negative for this fiscal year, what's that about?
So that would just be the fact that currently there is a projected a mismatch between your revenues and your appropriations. And so that is still forecast, and that can be changed through policy or through over or underperformance of taxes.
So if for this current year, like in an operational way, does that come out of the standing reserve?
So we will get to that.
Great, let's do it.
All right. So we can move back to stabilization reserve. I think we went through this. Are there any questions on it, or are we good to keep going? All right, I'll take that. So we're good to keep going. So as I mentioned, we have additional reserves. And so the stabilization reserve is enshrined in statute. Additional reserves are not, but they can be created by the General Assembly through session law. And so we'll just take a look here. And yes, take a look. And so they're usually dedicated to a specific purpose that the General Assembly has chosen to focus on, or, feels that they are mandated to focus on by the constituents, or what have you. And so if you take a look at some of these prior years, you can see examples of that. So in fiscal year 24, you can see on line 38 on the far left column there that a current year tax rate offset reserve was created. So the General Assembly chose to create a reserve in case you wanted to offset some taxes. So that's just an example of what the General Assembly can choose to do. You'll see that for the far right column, which is 2026 fiscal year, it's currently blank. That's because we're in session now. As of yet, there is no additional reserve. But if you decided you want to, let's just say, create another program, Y or Z, I'm not going to even try to give an example name here, that would populate in here. But if you decided we don't need any additional reserves, then these would stay blank. They don't have to be filled. That is totally a policy choice of you all as the representatives.
And just like as a mini committee history lesson, that sort of special reserve that we set up 2 years ago, was because we knew that likely last year's the amount of revenue we would need to raise would be a little bit larger than we normally do. We misestimated the scale of what would be necessary to offset, but we were anticipating a need to offset, and that's what that reserve is for. And again, that is a fairly unusual thing to do also.
Yeah, so absolutely. So, we've gone through, 6 sections so far. We're almost done. So now that we've gone through 2 of the 3 most likely revenue allocations, stabilization, additional, the third one is it can flow to the end of the outlook and, or as people usually ask, what's the bottom line? Well, this is what that bottom line is. And so our available funds section, after that revenue has moved through the 5 prior sections, I say 5 because if you recall that top section, the money doesn't actually touch it. That's just your summary section with the letters. That money will flow down all the way to line 40 on the bottom there, which is the current year unreserved, unallocated dollars. And so the prior year surplus can be seen on line 39, and that can be thought of as revenues available for this year. And so and just to clarify here, that line is how we get to line 40. It's not you have 39 plus 40. That 39 is how we get to that number on line 40, which it looks like that's 0.93, so $930,000 would be the forecasted number. And so in other words, these are funds that we use towards the education fund in our projected fiscal year 2026 right now. And so the way we get those surpluses, or I suppose you could, have a deficit, is you'll have revenues that either came above or below target in that prior fiscal year. They weren't spent or obligated for anything, so they just carried forward here to our current projected years, line 39. And so again, just to reiterate, line 40 is what you have left over after you've funded and spent on all of your appropriations, your stabilization. This is the leftover dollars. It's not attached to anything right now, that 0.93. So if everything that we have projected and talked about for 2026 fiscal year happened, we would end with $930,000 of extra money.
Are there instructions in the December 1st modeling with regard to what to do with unreserved, unallocated money?
Okay, so, that's a good question. So there aren't instructions. The reason that there is left over through December 1 letter is because in the modeling, we are required for the December 1 letter to say that it's a uniform rate change, homestead property and non-homestead, because we have to keep those rates the same. We usually end up with a little extra because we can't drill down quite to 0. So that's why through the December 1 letter, you have a little bit of extra. So it's not on purpose. It's just we would have to tweak maybe one tax and we need to keep for the December 1 letter, those rates uniform. So that number could change if, as you know, a committee, you decide, well, we want to increase or decrease X, Y, or Z, that number could totally change.
And the application of the prior year's unreserved unallocated with the December 1st letter modeling, how does that work?
So we carry that forward. So if you see in the middle column there, 2025, you'll see their current year unreserved unallocated is that same 33.4. So it just moves forward and it reduces the amount that, it would reduce any deficit that we would have at the bottom here. So basically, we don't need to raise that 33 million because we're taking from the prior year.
So it's like considered revenue?
Yes, for this purpose, it's considered a revenue.
Thank you.
Which is line 32,
I'm sorry, sir?
which is, it becomes line 32 and line 40. 32.1 million, 0.93 adds up to 33.04.
Oh, the total, not the line number. Okay, I see.
Right.
Which lines are you
Am I
saying?
missing that?
Well, sorry, you said line 32, so I was looking at the wrong section. I'm sorry.
So I mean, just looking at an allocation of revenue on line 32, that's a 32.1 million. Then the line 40 is 0.93. If you add those two up, it adds up to the 33.04. So you're using of the 33.04 from the current fiscal year, you're using 32.1 and you're reserving 0.93.
Yes, so
Is that right?
yes, so if we did not have that 33, you're correct, we would be below. So we need that 33 to hit that 0.93. It gets a little confusing because it shows it in black like it's a positive, but really we're taking from this line 40. So yes, I think what you're saying is, I think I understand what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. Just to sort of tie a bow on the conversation. So I think it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about these prior year unreserved unallocated funds that we're seeing on line 39, we can kind of think of like the ed fund has already been filled up a little bit with those 33 million. So we're considering that revenues in the December 1 letter were required to use all dollars from the prior year unreserved unallocated to uniformly lower the 3 property tax classes liability. So what we're saying here, to your point, how they're adding up together. Yes, and the reason that math checks out is because yes, we need to apply all 33 million to uniformly lowering the liability. However, we're talking about a 2 point whatever billion dollar fund. So we can't make the rates go out to, 20 decimal points. So at some point, you're not really gonna ever see a 0.000 on the bottom line of the ed fund because we can only go out to 4 decimal points.
Any other questions on that section?
I would just sort of further context. And I promise I'll stop being so professorial like by next week. Get like the history of some of this is helpful sometimes. The prior year of 33 is one thing from sort of and that it gets applied to the bottom line is feels less impactful or important as a policy decision that's sort of implicit in the December 1st letter. But if you look at the prior year in FY24 of 137 million, it becomes a much more substantial default policy choice, right? And that would result in much more debate. And just that's a place where sort of historically the difference between the default in the December 1st letter and the actuality of policy becomes much more controversial than in this year where we're just talking, $33 million would be a big deal to me personally. It's not an enormous deal to the education. Okay, thanks.
All right, well, hopefully, this presentation has been a little bit enlightening for all of you. That's really all I have prepared here. And, now hopefully you can look at this and say, I know what each of those sections kind of broadly means. And Yeah, if there are any further questions.
Representative Pickney.
Thank you. Thanks. If you go back to the top of the page, so the average homestead property tax rate and the uniform non-homestead property tax rate. And I noticed a note at the bottom that says that that fiscal year 2026 is the first year of the statewide adjustment CLA. So you can't really compare that 26 to the 25. But again, in comparing it, it's a 30% increase or close, right? So where does the justification come in for that almost 30% increase in that rate? I mean, is that considering that maybe there's a state CLA of 80%, so then there'd only be a 10% increase? How does that work?
I see Julia's mouth.
Yeah, so I think I'll let Julie answer it, because she's more familiar with CLA versus state to state. So,
Yes, absolutely. So yes, at its face, absolutely. We're seeing that significant change. You'll also note that there's a pretty significant change in line D, the property yield, which also goes into play. Spoiler alert, it's the same footnote for that. Both of those changes there between the average homestead property tax rate, the non-homestead property tax rate, and the yield, all of those pretty significant changes that you're noticing, at least a portion of those can be attributed to the formula, the math that's happening in the background. So essentially, big picture, what happened last year in the yield bill was there was a change to the intermediary math that goes into the CLA. So you'll recall that the CLA is a state adjustment mechanism. It varies by town, and it's accounting for the fact that there's no statewide reappraisal. So if your town was last appraised 20 years ago and the representative sitting next to you, his town was appraised last year, the CLA is aiming to make sure that regardless of when you were last appraised, you're paying into the statewide ed fund. So what happened last year in terms of that CLA change was, in the past, the CLA is bringing every town up to 100% of fair market value. We have a statewide average CLA of around 70%. So when you're bringing every town up to 100% of fair market value, and you've got a statewide average of 70%, that means almost all towns, if not all, I don't know, are being brought up. What the yield bill did last year was said, instead of bringing everybody up to 100%, we're going to bring everybody to the average. Which means that at the end of the day, when you're looking at your tax bill, there's no change in the rate because your CLA has been applied. What it does mean is that the pre-CLA rates are going to be different. So with that statewide adjustment, now you have that pre-CLA rate that's going to be closer to the post-CLA rate, which means the pre-CLA rate, when you have a statewide average CLA of 70%, that pre-CLA rate needs to be much higher. So that's what you're seeing here. You're not necessarily seeing a 30% jump in average liability. It was forecasted to be 13.8% last year, but instead you're seeing an increase in the pre-CLA rate, in large part due to that mathematical adjustment. Does that answer the question?
We're gonna spend a whole hour on the CLA on Friday, just so you don't have to get it.
Just real quick then, but again, so in that projection, you're using 70%, or it could be 80% in 2026, correct?
So the 70% is for FY 26. And the way that the math plays out, if it's 70%, if it's 20%, if it's 300%, it's not going to be impacting the tax rates that folks are seeing on the bills.
Okay.
It's being included in our yield model. So what we're doing is we're applying this factor in a lot of different places so that the application of the CLA is not going to swing as many tax rates up or down as much as it was in the past.
Okay, thank you. And as a lister for 30 years, it is a piece that I'm familiar with for sure.
Great. I think it's the place where probably the greatest misunderstanding from the field happens in all of this. Yeah.
So again, what was the purpose of moving it from trying to get everybody up to 100% as opposed to trying to get everybody to 78%? Was it to decrease the variability? What was?
Yeah, I would say that at least, I don't know why the Senate agreed to it, but I would, because I wasn't in the room while they were discussing it, but the conversation in the House committee was that there is sort of regular feedback from the field about the profound disruption, confusion,
They're
whatever
always
word,
worried about
whatever word you
this.
want, about the disconnect between when they receive tax rates and the sort of final tax rate that goes on people's bills, right? That, and often there was just a huge gap between that district tax rate and the town tax rate. And that was sort of that post CLA tax rate. And that we wanted to bring, I think transparency would be sort of a reach in the context of like mathy words that make people panic. But we wanted to sort of close the gap as much as possible between the pre-CLA rate and the post-CLA rate in order to bring a little bit more stability and a little less disruption and a little less, the only word I have is stochastic, and it's definitely the wrong word in this minute, like less spiky, less spiky situation. And so we essentially just added some algebra. And so that we moved something on one side of the that was on one side of the formula to the other side of the formula in order to make it which makes the district level rates a little bit higher across the board, but lowers the town level rates essentially, sort of. And we'll do more, we can see the algebra more clearly on Friday, which would probably make this clearer than me just talking about it with my mouth. But the intent was to lower the disruption to the field. I don't know if we were successful in that intent, given people's feelings about the CLA. And in the end, what will likely be the way to reduce disruptions from the CLA the most would be regular reevaluations of reappraisals. Yes, like that would actually be the way to lower the disruption from the CLA, because all the CLA is doing is trying to compensate for a thing that we do that's very strange and out of step with every other state in the country.
Good to get dentists in Orange County too, while we're at it.
I would, yeah, we'll also get some dentists for Orange County, Windham County.
My place, they keep it higher. There's not enough people to be work.
Yes. That's actually solvable, and we're gonna look through a really great report about it very soon.
Just a stupid question. So a line 32, for 2024, the 106 million. Is there, so I think you were saying that was transferred from because there was an unanticipated revenue that was put into the ed fund or was received in the ed fund. Is that correct? Am I getting that right?
So, sort of. So, so the 106, so it flips the positive and negative. So we transferred on that year, you have a transfer from unreserved, because if you take a look at line 27, you had a 94.8 million revenue deficit.
Yeah.
So the 106 is what was transferred from
From the ed fund.
well, from the unreserved, unallocated.
Okay.
Or the extra money. And I believe Rep. Kornheiser kind of pointed out that, you know, there was at one point 137.25 in the prior year unreserved, and then that dropped to 31. So you can, yes.
So the question, so it would show up in FY 2023 as to where that revenue actually was received. Is that correct? Yeah, all right.
Can you rephrase that, please? I'm not sure if that,
So the 106.2 or the 137 from the prior year.
Okay.
Reserved unallocated,
yes.
that came from FY 2023.
Yes, sir. That line came from 23. The 94 would have been from that current year of FY 2024.
Right. So and just to look at what was it in that previous year that was so positive in terms of revenue, it would have showed up in the revenue column above on 1 through 10, probably.
Yes, sir. That's correct. It would come from that that number.
Any other? Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. We are done for the morning. We are back here at 1:15. And we'll do something when we get here. I don't have the right page of my agenda in front of me to tell you what it is, but you can find on the agenda yourself. See you then.